Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Michigan School of Professional Psychology for our second annual Research Symposium hosted by Psi Chi. I'm very pleased that you are all able to make it to this event. I know your lives are busy, and if you're a student, it's third semester, and I know you have a lot going on. So we're glad that you're here. My name is Jessica Delasinski. I am a third-year doctoral student, and I'm also president of the Psi Chi Chapter at the Michigan School. The symposium's aim is to focus on ways in which humanistic psychologists can incorporate its values and strengths to develop interventions to address psychosocial and physical health effects for diverse populations. This symposium, the theme this year, focuses on the clinical implications in diverse populations. Today's topics will range from gender and ethnicity to include issues such as sexual orientation, culture, socioeconomic background, and disability status. I would like to provide you with a background on Dr. Fedon-Keyt. Dr. Fedon-Keyt is a clinical psychologist who is personally and professionally dedicated to issues on diversity and social justice. She completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Detroit Mercy. For the past 20 years, she has assumed the roles of clinician, trainer, consultant, clinical supervisor, crisis intervention team member, speaker, and activist. She works collaboratively with organizations and communities to support initiatives such as suicide prevention, trauma survivor services, safe training, and other inclusion efforts. She is currently a member of the MPA Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Responsibility. She previously served as the committee chairperson. Dr. Fedon-Keyt worked as a senior staff psychologist at the Juvenile Assessment Center in Detroit for 11 years, providing clinical services, court testimony, and didactic presentations while working with foster care, predispositional, and probation youth and families referred from various prevention and intervention programs. Things like the Youth Assistance Program, Prosecutors Diversion Program, Care Choices, and others. She was also the Director of Assessment at Oakland University's Counseling Center, where she both provided and supervised clinical services. She also provided trainings, cross-discipline collaborative efforts within the community and the university to its diverse student population. Presentations and clinical trainings to date have included diversity and social justice related topics such as microaggressions and resiliency, supportive interventions for diverse college populations, neurological development and juvenile justice issues, family-based interventions, diversity issues in assessment and intervention, experiential therapy techniques, effective behavioral intervention in milieu treatment, cognitive behavioral techniques, and multi-axial diagnoses and treatment planning. Given her clinical background and extensive experience, it is clear that we are very honored to have her here today as our keynote speaker for this year's symposium. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Fedon-Keyt as she talks about her experiences.
I'm really honored to be here, and I so appreciate Jessica and Dr. Shepler and everyone who participated in this event to bring it all together, to bring us all together. So I have worn a lot of hats. I think right now my main hats are working in private practice, and also I've actually stepped back into the chair position on the Michigan Psychological Association's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion and Social Justice. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where I come from, just because I think we all have our own stories that brought us to this work. And my story is that I think like lots of you, I got my master's degree first, and then I came back after working in the field for many years. I was actually studying psychology. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to get my Oh, there we go. Little technical glitch. I'm pretty tech friendly, but every once in a while I get, oh, what's going on up there? And it's a little thing down here. So I was studying psychology in the late 80s and early 90s, and it was actually in my personal life about when I was coming out of the closet as a lesbian, and so this was really helpful for me to be studying psychology and family psychology. But it was also kind of disconcerting about how I present myself, and I've just over the years observed so many changes in issues of diversity and how welcoming people are and how understanding and the safe spaces have really grown, and I'm very grateful for that. So then I went back to get my doctoral degree at UVM. So my hopes for this presentation, and I'm also hoping that okay, good, that's how that works. So my hopes for the presentation today is that we can all start to think about the context or the history that we have in psychology so that we can inform the work that we do. Recognize our own unique backgrounds for this work. Think about our own areas that we're curious about. We all came here for a reason, and those reasons may be as diverse as all of us. And I'd like you to each start thinking about your own work. I'm really excited to see the posters that are going to be presented after this talk. And really think about the value and impact of the research that we do, and challenge all of us to step outside what's comfortable. Because when we start working around issues of diversity, things can get very uncomfortable because we are not just looking out at what we don't understand, but also looking inward at why don't I understand this? What am I missing here? And really it takes some courage to have the conversations and ask those questions. And just basically to challenge ourselves to step outside what we're comfortable with. So I'd like to first talk about the context and history for diversity research in psychology. I'm just going to touch on that briefly. But I'd really like to talk about the story. Who's telling the story? Who's in the story? How is the story being told? Because that's really, whether you're thinking about it or not, that's what's happening when we're doing research. And there's an impact that diversity research has on social justice issues, in that if you look at what's happening in the news media right now as they're talking about transgender rights and having access to public bathrooms, which are for the public, that there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of old stereotypes and a lot of really awful things that are being presented as if they're facts, and the way we counteract that is by telling the story of what we actually know through doing research, what facts are actually out there, and being kind of the calm voice in the storm. I think that's what psychology can really bring to issues of social justice. So in preparation for today, I also interviewed two researchers that I know personally. One was my dissertation chair, Dr. Carol Weisfeld, who's an evolutionary psychologist teaching at UVM Mercy, and she does a lot of trainings on human sexuality and diversity. And then Dr. Bernadette Barton, who's a humanistic sociologist who lives and works in Moorhead, Kentucky. And Dr. Weisfeld does quantitative research, and Dr. Bernadette Barton does qualitative research, which I actually did not understand was kind of a focus of, we've got actual different tracks, I think, for the presentations today, so hey, fit right in. And I'd also like to talk about what humanistic psychology really brings to these discussions, and in the context of doing that, I'm going to talk about my own research and provide some thoughts and resources at the end for moving the conversations forward. So from a historical perspective, in thinking about who's conducting the research, I wanted to talk about some of the experiences I've had clinically as I've been in the world and kind of experienced what other people know. And several years ago, while working in Detroit, I was at a suicide prevention training where Dr. Sean Joe from University of Michigan was presenting some really groundbreaking research on suicide risk in African American communities. And the old narrative around that had been that these communities were not really at risk, that Black people would commit suicide. And there's a piece of that that really spoke to some sense of enduring and strength in those communities. And so sometimes people got pretty invested in, like, you can't take that away. And so Dr. Sean Joe and his colleagues were doing some research that found that actually there's a high toll that the minority stress in those communities are experiencing, and that when he started looking at the numbers in youth, he actually found that African American youth were under 12 were often at higher risk for completed suicides than other youth. So he was changing that whole narrative, and because he was having the difficult discussions around that, the discussions around minority stress, around microaggressions and macroaggressions experienced by Black youth, particularly Black male youth, we're all having some data to talk about now that we can talk about why that is. Why is there a higher risk, and what's going on? What are people experiencing that would lead them to view suicide as an option? And what I really took away from his talk, which was very powerful, is that as he was talking about his experience doing research where no one had really done research before, he said, if you're not counted, you don't count. So we need to change that narrative. And when we do research, and when we decide what we're going to study, our research that is exploratory really opens up new bodies of research. So if you do something, you have a question that doesn't seem to be out there, which is, I think it's getting harder, which is kind of a nice thing. But you might look at something in a new way. And once you break some ground, you're going to have other people jumping in there with you. Well, wait a minute, you didn't ask about this piece, or you didn't include this group of people that's important to me, and what do we know about that? And not everyone experiences this differently. You're having these conversations, and it opens up new ground. So what questions do we ask or fail to ask? The old adage that I heard in graduate school, and I kind of hope that this isn't still around, but I'd like to know if you've heard this before. The old adage was that if you want to get published, you find something that is pretty well researched and is out there, and then you do research that kind of, maybe you look at it in a new way, but you do something that's already been done, and maybe confirm the old research, and then you'll get published. Is that still out there as kind of a, hey, if you want to get published, do this? Okay. I'm glad, I kind of see some people that are maybe a little older. Okay, no one else has heard that. Forget I ever said that, because that's such bad advice. It's really, really bad advice. It came from a time, I think, where there weren't as many journals that were branching out from that, but in my first training, it was really unusual to step outside of that, and you had to be kind of brave, and I'll talk about that more when I talk about Dr. Weisfeld and my experience with her. So historically, thinking about how we conduct our investigations, who we include, what is excluded, who are we counting, how are we counting them, really becomes important. And as we look historically at what we thought we knew in psychology early on, I think we can think about who's telling those stories, who was doing the research back then, who's asking the questions now. Okay, and I've already talked about Dr. Sean Joe and Dr. James Jackson. So as an example of what I'm talking about, I'd like to talk about the narrative around academic success or failure. So this academic success or failure in schools and colleges, this has been studied quite a lot. And say 40 years ago, we were looking at academic success and what predicts that in terms purely of individual attributes. How intelligent might someone be? What are their scores and these predictive measures? What kind of skills and motivation does the student have? And we were really looking at the individual. But then we were also seeing individuals that we thought would be successful who were not staying in school, and it just didn't seem to make sense. And so people started asking the questions, well, what might they be experiencing different about maybe their environment, what's going on that's holding people back? And so increased research on diverse student groups gradually shifted the view from the individual into what's going on in the environment. And there's a heightened focus now. If you do any work in university retention studies, they're looking at how different groups experience the same learning environment and what makes that learning environment welcoming or unwelcoming. And they're really starting to understand, and I say starting because there's still a lot of work to be done here, starting to understand how important it is to provide safe space in a learning environment so that people aren't using their psychological resources to try to protect themselves or trying to feel okay while they're in those environments. So the retention research in universities has really converged on the idea of belonging. So just to talk about belonging a little bit, because I think it's very relevant to diversity research in general, according to the theory of relatedness, a sense of belonging involves personal involvement in a system or environment, so we're connected, a state of connectedness. It's that state of connectedness or that sense of belonging is accompanied by a sense of comfort or safety. So historically, this kind of comes from attachment theory, and that's where we experience our first belonging and how secure are those attachments. So whether you're talking about being in a school, a church, a college campus, or a neighborhood, a person's sense of belonging includes a sense of community, a feeling that one is an integral part of that community, that they're important within the community and they truly belong there, a sense that one matters to one's community. And when we study schools and universities, belonging is positively correlated to institutional commitment, how one really feels like yes, I'm a part of this, I belong here. And it's negatively correlated with dropout rates and academic struggle when you look at the research, which is again why we do research. So what has happened is that people were asking questions and doing qualitative studies and hearing about the stories of students who were struggling, and I think a lot of that actually came from counseling centers and people in counseling centers who are connected to research. And they started doing quantitative studies to verify what they had heard qualitatively through the stories of the students that they were talking to. Belonging is positively related to self-esteem, not surprising, but again, self-esteem, I think historically was thought of as an individual attribute that somehow some of us feel better about themselves. And this is shifting it into how do we support that sense of self-esteem and intention to persist? Are we valuing the students? So research has really shifted the conversations again from individual attributes to the quality of the environments that we're offering in schools and communities, and social justice issues related to how differently the same environment can be experienced by people depending on different aspects of identity, like are they a person of color? Are they some cultural group? I just wrote an article for the MPA newsletter about Islamophobia. And I work in Dearborn, so I hear the stories of my clients who live and work in Dearborn and their experience of how there's pockets of safety for them in Dearborn and in some other places, but then when they're out of the world, they never know how people are going to be reacting or experiencing them or whether they're safe or not. And social responsibility just in general is owning the facts about things. It's not turning a blind eye, it's being curious and doing something about the facts. And I was at a training several years ago where someone was presenting research on bringing historical figures of people of color into schools and having write-ups and having these pictures and these stories about people of color who've made huge differences, having those out there for all the students and how it correlated positively to academic success. And she was saying, in this type of research, when the corn fails, we don't blame the corn. If you were trying to grow a crop and it was failing, you would look at what you're doing, and somehow we historically have not done that socially. So when we look at LGBTQ research from a historical perspective, originally in psychology and in the world in general, gender and attractional nonconformity was originally studied purely as pathology. That was just an assumption. In 1957, has anyone heard of Evelyn Hooker's study? Yes. Okay, so she was curious about whether this idea of pathology could actually be proven by a quantitative method where you administer tests and then you look at the protocols without having a little blind test here, have experts in those protocols and look at the results. Could they tell from the test results, if this is pathology, which group was straight and which group was not? And so she studied 30 gay and 30 straight men and administered some projective instruments, and she got very well established experts in those instruments to review all of the protocols. And what she found was that they could not distinguish between the groups. It was very consistent. It's known as the Mule hypothesis confirmation, and this was completely groundbreaking. Now today, looking back, we're like, well, it's about time someone did that, and of course, and that makes complete sense, but historically at the time, that just flew in the face of everything that people thought that they knew. But it also spawned more research. And by 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the DSM in 1973, and the APA confirmed that, the American Psychological Association confirmed that they were in agreement to this in 1975, so it only took 2 years. Wheels sometimes move slowly. So as hopeful as this sounds, also these are the narratives, this pathology narrative is still very persistent today. And again, there's more and more research that we do to try to refute it, but those conversations can feel pretty exhausting when you've been around for a while. So again, early studies tended to be quantitative and they tended to be comparison studies. When you do comparison studies, there's a reference group. Who's the reference group? Historically, there's been one reference group. That reference group doesn't necessarily have a valid reference to some other experiences, depending on culture, depending on other aspects of identity. That's a very recent understanding. And I'd like to talk a little bit about university culture. When I talked with Dr. Carol Weisfeld at UDM, she's been teaching since the 1980s, and it was really interesting to listen to her stories. So she started teaching in the early 80s. She's an evolutionary psychologist, and when she was early on, she was pretty on the cutting edge of things, and she really made sure to talk with her students about gender, identity, sexuality, and yet through her first 10 years of teaching, she really didn't have any students that were wanting to do research in those areas. And so it wasn't until 1992 that a graduate student of hers lost my mouse thing. All right, I'm just, there's notes up here that I'm reading and I'm just gonna go off the notes. So she, in 1992, one of her students said, I want to do some research on BMN. And that had never been done before. And this was at UDM Mercy, so there's a religious component involved here. But her first thought was, how do I protect my student? Will they let us do this? And so she had to do some preliminary work. And I think that's true today when you're doing groundbreaking work or work that hasn't done before. You want to kind of look at who might get in the way and make sure they're kind of on board, or that if you're looking at communities that you don't belong to, how can you bridge the gap so that you can really access those communities? So she early on made sure that the dean was on board with this project, and she kind of paved the way for the student. I think she did a really good job kind of making sure that this would happen. That student went on to write a textbook about developmentally how lesbian, gay, and bisexual people tend to experience themselves in the world, and that textbook is still used today. So it made a huge impact just being able to do that research. And so what she also told me was that ever since that research was done, every year there's been at least one student who wanted to do research on sexual minorities. So once that door was open, a lot more people stepped through it. And what she has observed is that the space around doing that type of research has really gotten safer. She is someone who could, I think, kind of walk between worlds a bit in terms of how she experiences her community and her culture, but she was still very aware of the need for safe space and how safe space for researchers had been created by this study. What she also observed, though, was that in addition to the more and more research and more safe spaces, is that as we do research and we are confronted with our first, if you do quantitative research, you typically use kind of a demographic questionnaire. And there used to be very limited choices on that demographic questionnaire, and that has really changed. When I did my research that I'm going to talk about, it had not changed yet, and I tried to kind of clumsily do as best as I could to offer more options. And now, because there's been so much research where people have revised the demographic questionnaire, standard research now has a demographic questionnaire base that asks those questions, so that even if the original researcher doing the study is not asking questions around different areas of minority status or gender identity, sexual identity, that someone coming back could do a post hoc analysis so that information is still being gathered. And when you're putting a study together, it's hard to design a study and keep in mind all the things that you might be missing in the instruments that you're choosing. So now we have demographic questionnaires that in some ways help us avoid missing too much. So our measures evolve as our research is developing. And I wanted to mention my study group. So I mentioned that I tried to revise my demographic questionnaire. So I offered more than one group. I thought of all the groups that I could think of. I was working with 2 other researchers who thought this was a fine approach, and we looked at what was out there. This is many years ago. So I came up with this demographic questionnaire that seemed pretty on point. And I mean, as an out lesbian at the time, I thought, I'm pretty hip to this. I should know what I'm talking about, you know? And so I really thought that was a great approach. I also thought, well, you know, I don't know everything, so let's add a couple lines so that people can describe themselves. And the first thing that I noticed as I was at the end of the study looking at the demographic information was that I had a bunch of people that did not fit into my groups. So I made things a lot more complicated, and I'm glad that I did it, but I realized how narrowly even I was defining my groups, that there was a lot that I did not know, and how important it is to allow for that self-expression when you're doing quantitative research. Now, qualitative research is set up to do that because you're gathering stories and you're asking very open-ended questions. Quantitative research, not so much. We really have to watch ourselves. So, I talked about the demographic questionnaires. So, again, qualitative research has, I think, really paved the way to other models of looking at many things, including LGBTQ research. And it has, in gathering stories, and actually including his own story, Dr. Daryl Wing-Sue, I don't know if anyone's ever read Microaggressions in Everyday Life, excellent. And that allows for a lot of conversations in the area of diversity. So that's a book that I often refer to if people haven't read it. There's a changing narrative around marriage equality issues that, again, is because we've gathered stories. And I apologize, I can't see my notes very well, so I'm just going to press on here. So I was at a different suicide prevention. I want to give kind of a contrast story to what happens when we don't really understand what we're talking about and we press on anyway. So I was at a suicide prevention several years ago. There was an older presenter with pretty dated or generalized material. She was very, very well-intentioned. She did a lot of suicide outreach and a lot of outreach in schools, which to me, as I listened to her, was very concerning because she immediately started talking about lesbian, gay people as a single group, and then said, well, you know, there's too many letters. There's more letters out there, but I can never keep track of them, so I'm just not going to talk about those people. And she emphasized the risk factors, that there's more depression, more substance abuse, and you know, and then she kept saying, you know, there's a higher risk for this group, but we don't really know what that is. We don't know why that is. Why would this group be at? You know, we just don't know what it is about these people that puts them at higher risk. And that is the old narrative. That is the old narrative around race and culture and LGBTQ status. That's the old narrative. That somehow, you know, this group seems to be having some things that are in the way, and it must be about them. So. And she stated specifically there really isn't much research on transgender youth, which is true to a point, but the research is out there and it's growing. And actually Dr. Robinson from this school had just done a presentation that was really excellent around suicide risk and resiliency factors for transgender youth, and particularly transgender youth of color. So the research is there, the facts are there, you just kind of have to find it, especially if you're going out and talking to schools about these issues. Very, very, so I mean, of course my hand was up a lot and I tried to, you know, so do you think maybe it could be environmental stress? And oh, we really don't know. And I finally had to say, actually, we do know. I'm a psychologist, and here's some information. But I had to say that, and I put myself out there, and I did get some blowback from it. I was aggressive. And that's a hard thing to hear when you're just trying to, you know, I mean, really, I felt like I was dancing around like, well, do you think maybe? And then, okay. So, in my best effort, I tried to share some information, and I felt it was important to do that publicly, which I usually would not necessarily do, but she was presenting this to a group of administrators in schools, and she goes out and talks about this with children, and what kind of message are they getting when they're being talked about this way. So this misinformation was getting out there, and I thought it was important to confront that. So again, what happens when we look further? This is my response to this training here, so I'm just going to get this to you. So when we look further into LGBTQ suicide prevention in schools, we actually can use the minority stress model. And this model is used a lot in diversity conversations and understanding, that really you're looking at a situation where people are being treated as if they're other. So there's discrimination and bullying that is not in any way invited by the person who's the target. Microaggressions that they're experiencing kind of randomly, that creates a sense of stress and a sense of not being safe. And often people internalize a sense that somehow they're different, or they're wrong, or it's not okay who they are. And then this leads to a lack of belonging, again, and there's depression, poor academic performance, and anxiety. So yes, they're at risk for anxiety and depression, but the reason for this is not that there's some mysterious reason. It's very clearly that you're in a hostile environment. Again, when the corn isn't growing, you don't blame the corn. And there have been national surveys that have actually measured how often people are hearing slurs like "that's so gay" or "you're so gay," how unsafe gender non-conforming students feel. And there's a real bullying crisis for LGBTQ students in Michigan, that a 2009 survey found that 90% of Michigan students in secondary schools were verbally harassed at their school environment, and they were hearing biased language from school staff. Half of them never told family members about the bullying, because I think students, whether they're in secondary school or younger, often feel the pressure to succeed that keeps them from reaching out. And over half of the students who were harassed or assaulted never reported it to school staff who were there around, and sometimes witnessed what was happening. About a fifth skipped school within the month that the survey was done because of safety concerns on bullying. So if you've got, I'm sorry, I said a fifth, didn't I? About a fifth of them. So skipped school within the last month because of safety concerns. If you have a fifth that are doing that within a month of the survey, you've got a real problem with people not attending school and not having the opportunity to learn because they feel unsafe. So yes, LGBT youth report more depression and anxiety. This doesn't actually seem surprising when you look at their environments. And same with substance abuse. So minority stress matters. Students experiencing minority stress may present with clinically significant symptoms. And I have to say, working as a clinician in private practice, when you can discuss this type of research, it is extremely affirming to someone who is struggling to realize and to hear that there's evidence that this is not something that they've done or something that they're not doing. This is something that they're experiencing that not everyone experiences, and it's not their fault. Incidents of distress are higher in unwelcoming environments that are unsafe. But again, the story doesn't stop here, because now, as we've understood that, we're looking at, okay, there's a problem with the environment. What can we do to help with resiliency factors? How can we help people survive unsafe or unwelcoming environments? How can we make those environments more safe? What supports can we have there? What safe space can we build? How can we design interventions to build resiliency at all the different levels that are possible? So we're discussing diversity in research around issues of inclusion and social justice, because whether we acknowledge them or not, issues of social justice and inclusion are present in our world, and our research is used to provide a narrative for that. So we have a choice about whether or not we acknowledge the relevant issues and whether or not we educate ourselves, but the issues are there, and so it's what do you want to do? Researchers choose how they're studying this, how to understand their areas of interest. They choose their subjects and their subject groups. And they have a large part in developing and supporting the larger social narrative with what you'll hear in the news media as scientific evidence. Scientists have discovered this. We are the scientists. That's really exciting. And I believe that researchers have an ethical responsibility to the work that they're doing, and an awareness as much as possible about how their work might be used, because we shape the narrative. And as I was preparing for today, I was thinking, really when we do research, we're telling a story. We describe our theoretical model, the concepts that we're talking, so we set the stage. And we begin our literature with our investigations with literature that describes kind of the background story. And we describe our subjects or our characters in the story. How we go about telling the story, what we choose to emphasize as part of the narrative. And it provides areas for further research. Where is the story going? Where do we think the story is going? So always be mindful of the story when you're doing this work. When I was in my graduate class on diversity, the person who was talking to us about diversity issues talked about understanding our own story and going for the stories of others. That stories illustrate concepts. It provides a context for people and what they experience. It allows for taking other perspectives when you are going for the story, and it brings a sense of context and humanness. She liked to say that stories were really a bridge to each other and a bridge to ourselves. So when I was thinking about coming here, and I thought, well, humanistic psychology really has kind of built into its philosophy a knack for getting at the story, that we really challenge our assumptions and really try to understand. If you've ever seen some video of Carl Rogers talking with someone, I mean, he's just so empathetic and so just in the person's story. He's with them in the story. He's taking in as much as he can about the story. It's very inspiring to watch some of those old videos. He's also wearing beads, which is kind of he feels warm. I like watching these. So humanism at its core, though, is all about listening and valuing the other story. That you're not listening to dismiss or to correct. You're listening to value and understand. And I think sometimes we feel so pressured as psychology, and actually, or as psychologist. And Rachel, in her previous clinical training this morning, she was talking about how would you fix these problems for your client. And it was kind of a trick question, because really we don't fix our clients' problems. We don't correct the problems. We try to find the narrative, try to find and understand and empathize and walk with our clients as they discover what resources they have and what they can do to figure things out in their lives. And that's our role. So we're not fixing, we're trying to understand. Humanistic psychology also brought to the table, historically, a lot of qualitative research, which I think it just lines up so well with diversity research that you would want to get the story before you try to understand it quantitatively. And there's a natural tendency, again, to challenge the assumptions. So one of the earliest things presented was Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a concept. And this really takes it out of what is, we can have conversations here about what resources are necessary before a person can reach these more self-actualized levels or this esteem levels. Like, what do we need to get there? And of course, that's led to our more recent understanding of the hierarchy of needs. So, humanistic psychology really has an openness to a non-judgmental exploration of the experience of others and an openness to dialogue. And again, Carl Rogers with unconditional positive regard, I think really led by example in his work. So I wanted to talk a bit about my friend, Dr. Bernadette Barton. So I mentioned she teaches in Kentucky. She teaches actually at Morehead State University, which is in the same small town, and this is where I got my master's, but it's the same small town that Kim Davis is in. So if you've been listening to the marriage equality resistance that's out there, she's the one who's gotten a lot of media attention about denying marriage licenses. So Dr. Barton has been right in the thick of all of this. And she, in her career, has really looked at different members of marginalized groups through her qualitative studies, and she's very immersive. She really goes out into communities, but she lives in Kentucky in the Bible Belt, so I think an immersive experience is kind of how she's been living for the last 20 years or so. She's a Midwestern white woman who's living in the Bible Belt and did not grow up there, so she kind of needs a translator sometimes and has had to really try to understand what's around her. So she's interested in issues of social justice. She has a particular interest in transformation, what inspires change in individuals that were previously very oppressive. And she recently wrote a book called Pray the Gay Away, which is a wonderful collection of that particular context, what people in the Bible Belt who are LGBTQ experience and how they make an environment that is not welcoming and is very judgmental. And in order to do the study, she did this again immersively, so she went to like an Exodus conference, the 5-day conference for people who were feeling that they were ex-gays, that there was a way to somehow cure. So again, that old narrative is still pretty persistent. And she went to this conference and found herself in a group with women who were mothers of gay sons. And she said that she found herself feeling very compassionate and really trying to understand their point of view. She couldn't quite get there with their point of view, but she understood that they truly did love their sons, and they were, in a strange way that she hadn't really thought about, they were experiencing some rejection from their own community because the old narrative, again, was that somehow the moms had done something wrong and their sons had turned out gay, and this was awful. So she immersed herself in this for 2 days out of a 5-day study, and then had to, I think, get some breaths of fresh air after that experience, but it's a really interesting read. And Andrea, I didn't get a chance to talk with you, but she gave me, Dr. Barton gave me permission to share the autoethnographic dilemma article about the stories. Is that available online, or is that something that, did you have print copies of it?
I can get copies of it.
Okay, so there's copies. She gave me permission to share a story that she wrote about being sensitive to whose stories she was telling and how she was telling them, because she was interviewing a lot of couples, as she found, LGBTQ people in Kentucky. And so she would get one story from one person and maybe not get a chance to interview the other person if the other person didn't want to be involved, but then the stories are often about the relationship between the two and how do you resolve that ethically. So as she was talking about her research, she said, you always have to protect the subject. That was her #1 priority. So I think we get that in our classes about how to do research, but she really felt that it was so important. It was absolutely the first thing that she talked about, that we're gaining the confidence and informed consent of people, and yet we're the ones who really ultimately understand what that means, and so we have to guard their lives anyway. And be mindful about how publishing might affect the subjects that you have. And she said, you always have to go with your gut and err on the side of caution. And the qualitative research, as I mentioned, can take a personal toll when you do an immersive study, particularly if you're deep within a group that you don't necessarily belong to. It can be stressful. And stories of abuse, loss, and trauma can cause some strain. So she advised to stay curious and make sure that you get some breaths of fresh air. So always be a person first. People are hungry to talk. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to kind of speed up a bit here. To make it a natural interview, ask open-ended questions. So a lot of the things that we hear in classes around doing qualitative research, and again using colleagues that are members of communities that you don't necessarily belong to help bridge any diversity gaps and make sure that you're gathering information as completely as you can. So I wanted to talk a bit about my own research. That I did research on that used an instrument called the Marriage and Relationship Questionnaire, and I did my research at a time where, again, I was a little older because I had worked as a master's level clinician for many years before I went back, but it was back when Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the Defense of Marriage Act were still very much in place and had been in place for many years and were still several years from being repealed, so it wasn't even really in the realm of possibility at that time that those were going to go away. We just kind of had learned to live with the reality that was existing at the time. The mark was developed for use with heterosexual straight couples, and I wanted to look at long-term couples who were gay, lesbian, and straight. So I had my predetermined groups again that people ended up not fitting in neatly into. I was also interested in religion and spirituality as kind of different concepts. I looked at self-esteem, and because the mark was designed for use with heterosexual couples, I had to revise it to be able to use it with my couples in the different groups. So it really became the first application of the mark with same-sex couples. So I'm going to briefly talk about what my research was going for. So I looked at what is marriage, and that historically, and when you talk about people, it's not just a contract legally, that and when you look at the research, people often call it, kind of refer to it as a kind of secure base, that you have this person that you come home to, the person who understands and accepts you. Ideally, that's what we're going for in a marriage. It is a legal contract and a personal commitment and a lot more. And when you talk to people who have religious background, they also talk about what it means to have the relationship as a sacred bond or something that's sanctified and kind of set apart from just living together. So there's many, many facets of marriage and how people view it. And there's not one common narrative around that, but there may be some common factors I thought I could get to through the research. So again, at the time of the study, LGBTQ couples could not be legally married anywhere in the United States. And I think understanding that context is really important for understanding the study. I looked at religion and spirituality as different but somewhat overlapping, where religion is more affiliation and subscription to certain beliefs, and then spirituality is more of this kind of intrinsic sense of meaning or purpose or connection with a higher power. So separate but somewhat overlapping. And when you look at the research between religion and marriage, the research suggests that there's a positive correlation between religious affiliation and relationship satisfaction. But again, all of that was done with heterosexual couples, and drawing from my own life experience, I thought, oh, that's not really true necessarily for LGBTQ couples who, not only could we not get married, but we were hearing messages like, don't tell grandma because it would kill her. And so there's also, within the research on religion and heterosexual marriage, there's a lack of consensus about concepts. So it was really kind of messy, and I like messy, so I got very curious and tried to dive into the messiness of it. And my core premise was that heterosexual couples and LGBTQ couples would have probably different experiences of religion. There was some dissonance between our belonging and the religion that would sanctify a marriage. So there were not a lot of quantitative studies at the time on religion, spirituality, and relationship satisfaction in same-sex couples, and the results that did exist were very inconsistent. So there was, what I proposed was a model where spirituality would maybe mediate the effect, presumably negative effect often, of religious exposure with relationship satisfaction. And then I also looked at self-esteem as a separate factor, basically because my diversity chair told me I needed to do that. So I'm going to kind of skip through here. Okay, I had very neatly designed hypotheses around how all of those things interacted, and I was very interested in it. My last hypothesis that self-esteem would correlate positively with spirituality for same-sex couples, I included heterosexual couples for comparison, and what I found that actually the correlation was really strong, and it was really strong for heterosexual women, but for some reason heterosexual men didn't experience that correlation, which actually suggests that there's something else that's really protecting the self-esteem of heterosexual men. So I used online recruitment and sampling and did all the informed consent. Online, if you've ever done online research, it's really nice. Again, in my early training, I was coding things by hand, and so online stuff, it's like, oh, you just download it into an Excel file. This is amazing. I mean, hours and hours saved. So that's my kind of old fogey, like, technology is really amazing. Okay, so I ended up, though, with 527 people that actually returned these questionnaires, and I should mention, the mark R is 206 questions. So, and that's just part of what I was going at. So people really devoted a lot of time to completing this survey that I had passed out. And I, again, tried to sort into neat groups. And so of those 527 questionnaires, I had to dump 16 of them because they didn't fit into my groups, or I couldn't even figure out. I would have one person, because it was a matched pair study, I would have one person describing themselves as a lesbian in a lesbian relationship, and then the other person that I was trying to match to identified as trans, or identified as queer, or something else that did, and I did not feel comfortable adjusting those descriptions just so that I had subject groups. So I ended up with 120 people in each of my subject groups, and then the rest of it was kind of an area for further study. So what I found, though, was that the most interesting thing about my study was not about my results. It wasn't about the hypothesis testing. It was about the MARC-R itself, revising a very detailed relationship questionnaire for use with LGBTQ subjects. And so, we revised it. There was 3 of us working on the project. We did a lot of validity examination of whether this was really, this is an equal measure for use with these couples. And it wasn't just about changing the language. We did revise a few items. And we kept the items from the original just to see that they were performing the same way as the one that we had revised. So what we found is that the love and partnership scales from the MARC, which have found in previous studies to be most reliable across cultures, that those resulted in these graphs where you have a group of heterosexual, gay, and lesbian couples. And when you look at the items, the values of those items are things like, do you find your spouse easy to get along with? Is your partner or spouse kind to you? And when you see the way that this is laid out, it suggests that we're really looking for the same things in relationships, that we have the same values around what we are looking for in our most intimate relationships. Again, as a lesbian who's out doing research, I'm looking at this going, oh, well, of course, no big deal. Let me get to my hypothesis testing. This is the love items. So this previous one is the partnership items, love items. They're virtually identical among the groups. And I'm just thinking, of course, let's move on. And my dissertation chair is like, this is the null hypothesis again. This is amazing. And I just didn't have that perspective about it. So I'm conscious of time. I had a few other things to say about, to inspiring our own work, but I am conscious of time and I want to leave some room for discussion. But my own kind of blindness around this was that I didn't really do a lot around publishing, or really, because I just didn't think it was that big of a deal, that of course we're looking for the same things in relationships. But actually now with the narrative that's being kind of revisited by very conservative groups, it would be great to get this research out there. And so I was talking with Carol Weisfeld about that. What she really wanted me to know, though, was that ever since I did this research, as she's taught her human sexuality classes, she's presented this research to her classes, undergraduate and graduate, and she said particularly in the undergraduate classes, when she shows these slides, she said, Ellen, you can hear the jaws dropping, that people just haven't had this narrative yet, that their jaws are dropping. And again, I'm thinking, like, of course, you told me that last time. And then she said, no, you don't understand. Every year it's the same thing. And she said, this year there was one undergraduate person. This is kind of a conservative academic environment at UDM. She said there was one openly gay young man in the class. And she said, I presented this, and just like always, everyone's jaw was dropping. She said, except for him. He slammed his hand down on his desk, and he said, yes, I knew it. And that's the value of really getting someone's story. So I think I'd like to actually end there, because I feel like I'm kind of revved up like a motor with all of the other stuff. So I'm so grateful to be here, and I would really like to know about any questions or anything that I may have touched on and didn't really talk about that's of interest to you that you might want to share something about. My wife, Deb, is in the audience, and she's reminding me, count to 10. One thing I wanted to mention is that there are certain concepts that we have borrowed from sociology or from different fields, and I think that's important because psychologists, although we do a lot of the research, we're not necessarily on the cutting edge of the discussions around diversity. And also, we apply diversity models like microaggressions. We can relate to those concepts, and different groups may relate in different ways and experience very different microaggressions in very different safe spaces. So we can't make an assumption of sameness. I'm really open for questions or yeah.
You mentioned studying microaggressions. I'm not sure if this question will fit well, but has anyone studied like the opposite, microaffirmations for people feel?
That is a really great question. If you can't hear it, he's asking that okay, we're studying microaggressions. Has anyone studied, say, microaffirmations? I think this is a really great example of what humanistic psychology brings to the discussion, because you're very, very easily looking at the positive and looking at the resiliency. And that's not something that traditionally, I'm from a psychoanalytic program, we don't necessarily do that very well. I'm not aware of that as the labels used in studies, but when you look into resiliency factors and building resiliency in communities, they do speak to those concepts. So if you're interested in doing research in that area, I would look at resiliency studies. Yeah. Dr. Schindler.
Several of the folks here are currently in or recently taken or will soon take evidence-based practice class. How do you take this? You mentioned sharing your research with a client to impact clinical work. How do you take this type of research any more on that? And how you use it?
I think I'm going to touch on what you're talking about. I want to tell a little story because, again, the evidence creates narrative, and sometimes we get carried away with what we think we know. And I was at a training on an instrument that had been recently revised, and the person was talking about a case example, and their whole narrative was that this person was, from the numbers, just so fragmented in their sense of self, so paranoid about their environment, so frightened of other people, that they were spending so much energy around all of this that they were failing in school, they were failing in their community. And then as they talked about the person's background, the person was a young white person in a very conservative area the whole community was really insular, so there was really not a lot of contact with people outside of that community, and they identified as gay. So that person would have lost everything had they come out. The presenter was a straight white man who just didn't have that narrative in his own background and was missing, I thought, a lot of what may have really gone on. How is this person feeling fragmented? Is this coming from inside of this person that they feel fragmented? Or are there significant pieces of who they are that are not being welcomed? Would be one thing, but they're not even, they would lose everything. They would lose their community, their family relationships, their friends. They would lose everything that they know in this insular community. And the presenter was saying this is kind of like someone, from their point of view, it was like someone trying to drive down the freeway in a car that wasn't working right. And so I ask questions and I try to kind of lead people, and it doesn't always work. So there were a couple other people in the audience that were kind of on board with things, but there were other people that pointed out what the person would lose if they came out, and then I presented an alternate view of this person isn't in an inferior car, they're in a car that they're trying to dodge obstacles and dangers that other people don't experience, and that's taking all of their energy. So when you're talking about evidence-based work, we have to think about interpretation of the work, and it's really important to understand what you know to get those stories again. Did that? Yeah. Did you want to add anything too?
No.
I mean, you're a researcher, so. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today.